Inside the frightening mind of Bryan Kohberger, True Crime Explained. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button and let us know where you are watching from in the comment. It was just past 4 a.m. on November 13th, 2022. A quiet Sunday morning in the small college town of Moscow, Idaho. The streets were still. The air was freezing. The campus had fallen into its usual weekend slumber after a night of parties and college life. But inside one house on 1122 King Road, four students lay brutally murdered and no one knew. There were no screams heard, no forced entry. 2 roommates were left untouched. And yet, the crime that took place in that house would become one of the most chilling, confusing, and captivating murder cases in recent American history. From the outside, 1122 King Road looked like any other off-campus rental. A 3-level home with string lights and patio furniture. The kind of place where you could hear laughter, music, and the chatter of young life on any given weekend. Inside lived 6 students from the University of Idaho. They were full of dreams, full of youth. That Saturday night, 4 of them, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernadle, and Ethan Chapin, went about their usual routines. Madison and Kaylee hit a local bar. Xana and Ethan attended a fraternity party. By 1:45 a.m., all 4 were back home. By 4 a.m., they were dead. Kaylee was just 21, blonde, radiant, full of life. She was set to graduate early and had already landed a job in tech. She'd returned to Moscow for the weekend to visit her best friend Madison, her ride or die. Madison, also 21, was outgoing and sharp. She and Kaylee had been best friends since 6th grade. Wherever you saw one, you saw the other. Xana, 20, was known for her warm smile and sarcastic wit. That night, she was with her boyfriend, Ethan, also 20, a triplet from nearby Conway, Washington. They were young, they were loved, and within minutes, they were all stabbed to death in their own bedrooms. The call to 911 didn't come until nearly 8 hours later, around 11:58 a.m. 2 surviving roommates, who had slept through the attack, awoke to a scene they could not understand. One of them found a body. They assumed their friend had simply passed out. It wasn't until police arrived that the horror truly began to unfold. For bodies, multiple stab wounds, no signs of sexual assault, no defensive wounds, no sign of forced entry. The weapon, a large, fixed-blade knife, still missing. The killer was gone. The house was silent, and the community was shattered. Moscow hadn't seen a murder in over 7 years. It was a peaceful college town, tucked in the hills of Idaho. Now, parents were pulling their kids from campus. Students were locking their doors and sleeping with weapons. For weeks, police gave little information, urging patience. Rumors exploded online. Was it an ex-boyfriend? A stalker? A roommate? Armchair detectives flooded Reddit, TikTok, and YouTube, analyzing every clue. The lack of answers only intensified public obsession. But there was someone else watching the chaos unfold. He was tall, quiet, awkward, a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, just 10 miles away. And his name was Bryan Kohberger. He'd grown up in Pennsylvania, a loner, struggled with obesity in his youth, said to have been bullied. Later, he lost weight, got into criminal justice, and became obsessed with the minds of serial killers. He wasn't just studying murder. He was fascinated by how killers felt, why they did it. He asked questions like, how did you feel before, during, and after your crime? What did you seek from your victims? What emotions drove you? And here's the chilling part, he didn't ask those questions in secret. He posted them on Reddit, seeking input from real ex-cons. For research, he said. He was a PhD student, working just across the border in Pullman, Washington. In the early days of the investigation, police were stuck. But then, one clue broke things open. A white Hyundai Elantra seen near the crime scene around 4 a.m. No license plate, no suspect, just grainy footage. But it was enough. Authorities began checking every white Elantra in the area, over 20,000 cars. And one of them belonged to Bryan Kohberger. Bryan had tried to cover his tracks. He turned off his phone during the murders, exactly between 2:47 a.m. and 5:32 a.m. He wiped the car clean, deleted some apps, even drove back to Pennsylvania for the holidays. But the digital trail betrayed him. Cell tower data showed his phone had pinged near the victim's home 12 times before the murders. He had stalked them. A knife sheath, left on Madison's bed, contained DNA that didn't match any of the victims or known guests. Weeks later, police matched it to Bryan's father via genetic genealogy. The walls were closing in. December 30th, 2022. Bryan Kohberger was arrested in the early morning hours at his parents' house in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. When police entered the home, Bryan was wearing latex gloves. He had been seen cleaning the car. He was putting his trash in his neighbor's bins. Inside, they found a stash of knives, dark clothing, and even surveillance footage of himself from his own apartment, keeping track of his own movements. The motive? Why? There was no known connection to the victims. No message. No manifesto. And Bryan? He said nothing. No confession. No apology. Just cold silence in the face of 4 destroyed families. Was it revenge for rejection? A desire to feel control? Or something darker, rooted deep in a mind trained to study horror, but incapable of resisting it? One thing was now clear. Bryan Kohberger had spent years learning how to think like a killer. And one night in November, he decided to stop thinking and become one. But what went through his mind as he planned it? How did he choose his victims? And why did he feel so calm afterward? Why did you choose your victim? What did you feel during the crime? How did you prepare? What were you thinking afterward? These weren't just the questions law enforcement asks convicted killers. They were questions Bryan Kohberger had been asking online for months, even before the University of Idaho murders occurred. Except he wasn't asking as an investigator. He was asking as a student, and maybe as a future killer. Before he became a national headline, Bryan Kohberger was an anonymous face in a classroom. He had enrolled in a PhD program in criminal justice and criminology at Washington State University in Pullman, just across the border from Moscow, Idaho. His professors considered him quiet but serious, focused, detail-oriented. Some students described him as intense and socially awkward, with a piercing stare that made people uncomfortable. He had moved to the area only a few months before the murders. He had access to forensic software, research tools, crime scene theories, behavioral profiling. In short, Bryan Kohberger had everything he needed not just to understand crime, but to design one. Months before the murders, a chilling Reddit post surfaced in a thread for ex-cons. The user claimed to be a criminology student at DeSales University conducting a study on the psychology of crime. The questions were eerie. Did you prepare for the crime before leaving your home? How did you leave the scene? How did you feel after committing the crime? How did you choose your target? The post was signed off with a request for participants to share as much detail as possible. The survey link was real. It was tied to Bryan Kohberger's academic profile. At the time, it was just a student conducting research. But in hindsight, it feels more like a confession written in reverse, as if Bryan were mapping out his own future crime. Bryan wasn't new to the world of true crime. Those who knew him in high school and college say he was deeply interested in serial killers, forensic psychology, and murder cases. He had interned at a local police department in Pennsylvania, where his role was to assist in technical data analysis, basically to learn how police track suspects. He had studied the BTK killer, Ted Bundy, the Zodiac. He wasn't just reading Wikipedia pages. He was analyzing them, learning their methods, comparing behavioral patterns, repeating the phrase mind over emotion in his personal journals. At DeSales University, his master's thesis focused on how emotions and psychological traits impact decision-making in criminals. But something was off. This wasn't curiosity. It was fixation. Bryan Kohberger never fit in. In childhood, he was overweight, bullied, socially awkward, struggled with eye contact and connection. His family was tight-knit, but he remained emotionally distant. In high school, he turned to drugs, especially heroin. Arrest records show minor offenses. A mugshot from years prior shows a gaunt, unshaven face, lost and spiraling. But then he changed. He got clean. He lost weight. He switched paths toward academia. Criminal justice gave him structure, logic, control. People noticed the physical transformation, but the emotional void remained. One female classmate later said, "There was something about the way he looked at you, like he was staring through you." In graduate school, Kohberger stood out, but not for the right reasons. He corrected professors, talked over classmates, asked jarring questions about killing methods and serial patterns. He made some students feel so uncomfortable, they asked not to work with him on group projects. Yet professors described him as brilliant, analytical, sharp, deeply interested in crime theory. But interest isn't always academic. Sometimes it's personal. Let's rewind to early fall 2022, just months before the murders. Bryan begins researching a specific white Hyundai Elantra. He reportedly starts driving past 1122 King Road. Phone pings place him near the victim's home 12 times before the murders. This wasn't chance. It was surveillance. He followed a pattern, driving late at night, circling the area, turning off his phone when near. He didn't know the victims personally, but some believe he may have seen them at nearby locations, maybe at a restaurant or a campus event. They were everything he wasn't: social, attractive, surrounded by friends. Some criminologists suggest Bryan may have seen them as a symbol of the rejection he always felt. And that night in November, he made them his final study. Experts in forensic psychology have since pieced together a potential profile of Kohberger. High-functioning but emotionally flat, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, possible narcissistic or schizoid personality traits, a fixation on control and intellectual superiority, an intense desire to experience the act of murder firsthand. In other words, someone who felt powerless for most of his life until he found a way to seize complete control over someone else's. Murder wasn't an impulse. It was a thesis. When Bryan was arrested, he showed no visible remorse. No tears. No panic. He acted calm, even cold. One officer said it was as if he were observing the arrest like a scientist watching an experiment play out. Even now, Bryan Kohberger has refused to explain why he did it. But maybe the answer was in his survey all along. What were you thinking after the crime? His silence speaks volumes. By the time the nation knew his name, Bryan Kohberger had been planning for months, down to the details, turning off his phone, wiping down the car, wearing gloves, watching documentaries about serial killers. But even the most calculated plan has cracks. And in Chapter 3, we'll follow the trail of digital mistakes, DNA evidence, and surveillance footage that turned a PhD student into a murder suspect, across state lines, in a manhunt that exposed his every move. Because no matter how intelligent the killer, there's always something they forget. For more chilling true crime stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. November 13th, 2022, 4:20 a.m. The killer had vanished into the darkness. For lives had been taken with a knife in the quiet town of Moscow, Idaho. The attack was fast, brutal, precise. There were no signs of forced entry, no screams that anyone remembered, just silence. And while investigators combed through the bloodied house at 1122 King Road, somewhere, miles away, Bryan Kohberger was already preparing for the next step. He didn't panic. He didn't run to another country. Instead, he made a decision that surprised even veteran FBI agents. He went home for the holidays with his dad. The night of the murders, Bryan's cell phone was off from 2:47 a.m. to 5:32 a.m. That time gap? That's when the killings happened. When his phone finally came back online, it pinged near Blaine, Idaho, more than 30 miles away, suggesting he was already leaving the area. But here's what disturbed investigators even more. Just hours after the murders, he returned near the crime scene. At 9:12 a.m., his phone connected to the tower that covers 1122 King Road. Why? Was he checking the police response? Was he admiring his own work? No one knows for sure. But that return visit sealed a pattern, one only a compulsive, organized mind would risk. Weeks passed. Bryan acted like nothing had happened. He attended classes, held office hours as a teaching assistant, quietly corrected his classmates with that same dead stare. Professors say he didn't miss a beat, but behind the scenes, something had changed. He washed his car obsessively. The white Hyundai Elantra, central to the investigation, was scrubbed, detailed, and wiped clean. Trash was thrown out at night in neighboring bins. Latex gloves were used during routine chores. Then, in mid-December, Bryan's father flew from Pennsylvania to Washington, and the two began a cross-country drive back to their family home in the Poconos, nearly 2,500 miles away. 10 hours a day, side by side, father and son. A road trip meant to feel normal, but authorities were already watching them. Law enforcement had begun piecing things together. The Elantra was caught on surveillance cameras multiple times the night of the murders, speeding past King Road at 3:29 a.m., again at 4:04 a.m., and fleeing the scene shortly after. Cell tower data showed Bryan's phone was in the exact same area on several occasions before the murders, especially late at night. The knife sheath left on Madison Mogen's bed contained touch DNA, traced not through Bryan himself at first, but through his father, thanks to genetic genealogy. By the time Bryan and his dad pulled into the driveway in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, federal agents had eyes on the house. They monitored everything. Despite the meticulous planning of the murders, Bryan began making small mistakes, classic signs of a suspect who believes they're untouchable. Latex gloves inside the house. When police raided the Kohberger family home on December 30th, Bryan was found wearing latex gloves inside. It wasn't for COVID. It was to avoid leaving fingerprints on anything he touched. Throwing out trash, but not in his bin. He was seen taking his garbage out at 3 a.m., but instead of using the family's trash cans, he used neighbors' bins across the street. The trash that betrayed him. Police retrieved that discarded trash. A DNA sample from his father matched the knife sheath left at the crime scene with an accuracy of 99.9998%. It wasn't just a match. It was the nail in the coffin. December 30th, 2022. Around 1:30 a.m., a team of FBI agents, state troopers, and local police executed a search warrant at the Kohberger home. They broke down the door. Bryan was taken by surprise, no time to run, no time to hide. In the home, they found multiple knives, a black face mask, a computer and hard drives. Bryan's Hyundai Elantra, parked outside. Neighbors later reported that Bryan hadn't shown much emotion. In fact, he seemed almost robotic calm, as if watching a story unfold that he already knew the ending to. The public was stunned. How could someone with a 4.0 GPA in criminology be behind one of the most brutal murders in recent memory? Students at Washington State University said he seemed odd, but not dangerous. One student recalled, "He always wanted to seem smarter than everyone else. If someone answered a question, he'd correct them in front of the whole class. He made people feel stupid." Another said, "He told me he believed people had auras and energy, but I never thought he could kill." His professors were even more shocked. They had seen him as intense, yes, but also brilliant. But perhaps that brilliance is what made him so dangerous. Serial offender profilers often talk about the God complex, the belief that the killer is smarter than everyone, untouchable, and more evolved than the average person. Bryan Kohberger seemed to fit this model. He studied law enforcement tactics. He understood surveillance methods. He obsessed over criminal psychology. And still he was caught. Because even the most calculated minds overlook one thing: human error. After his arrest in Pennsylvania, Bryan waived his right to fight extradition. He told the judge, "I am not afraid to be exonerated." It was the first and only time he spoke with confidence in public. Within days, he was flown back to Idaho under heavy guard, wearing a bulletproof vest. His arrival caused a media frenzy. Protesters gathered. Reporters swarmed the courtroom. And the families of the victims, who had waited for weeks with broken hearts, finally saw a face. A blank, pale, hollow face, Since returning to Idaho, Bryan has said nothing about the murders. No confession, no expression of remorse, no apology to the families. His attorneys say he intends to fight the charges, possibly on mental health grounds or procedural issues related to the search and DNA collection. But prosecutors say the evidence is overwhelming. And the public? They're not buying the defense. They want justice for 4 innocent students whose lives were cut short. Why did he do it? There's still no clear motive. Was it a thrill kill? Was it to prove a theory he studied? Was it revenge against people he saw as better than him? No one knows. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because Bryan Kohberger wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. He was a student. He was someone's classmate. He was sitting in lectures asking questions about murder while allegedly planning one himself. In the end, Bryan Kohberger didn't flee the country. He didn't go into hiding. He drove across the country with his father like nothing happened. He believed he had done everything right, cleaned the car, wore gloves, deleted apps, hid the trash. But what he didn't realize was that from the moment he returned to the crime scene that morning, he had already made his first mistake. January 5, 2023, Lada County Courthouse, Moscow, Idaho. The courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for space. Phones were held high, lips whispered, eyes stared. On the other side of the bulletproof glass stood Bryan Kohberger, shackled at the ankles, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his face emotionless. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He barely blinked. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. It had become a nationwide obsession. And Bryan? He had become America's most studied suspect. Not just by prosecutors, but by millions of strangers online. The moment Bryan's name was released, TikTok, Reddit, and YouTube went into overdrive. True crime creators rushed to publish theories. Videos of Bryan's court appearance racked up millions of views within hours. Internet sleuths dissected every photo, every movement, every quote. People zoomed in on his shoes, analyzed his posture, compared his facial expressions across court appearances. Was that a smirk? A twitch? Guilt? Arrogance? Thousands of users posted screenshots of his past Reddit surveys. Old classmates came forward with chilling stories, and web detectives began investigating every known detail of his life. But what made Bryan's case different was the eerie symmetry. A man who studied the minds of killers had now become the subject of millions studying him. In court, Bryan looked like a ghost. Thin, pale, hollow. He showed no emotion when the judge read the charges. 4 counts of first-degree murder. 1 count of felony burglary. When asked if he understood the charges, he responded calmly, "Yes, I do." He waived his right to a speedy trial. His attorneys signaled he intended to plead not guilty. But prosecutors had a mountain of evidence. Cell tower pings, surveillance footage, DNA on the knife sheath, a match to his white Hyundai Elantra, his digital behavior post-murder, and perhaps most haunting of all, his silence. As Bryan stood before the court, the families of the victims sat just feet away. Kaylee's father clenched his fists. Madison's mother wept softly. Ethan's siblings stared blankly. Xana's family held each other. For weeks, they had endured endless rumors, internet speculation, and wild accusations. But now, they were staring into the eyes of the man accused of taking their children from them. And he didn't look like a monster. He looked normal. That was the scariest part. Bryan's own family was stunned by his arrest. His parents, Michael and Marion Kohberger, issued a joint statement expressing support for their son while also acknowledging the pain of the victims' families. They pledged to cooperate with law enforcement. But that statement was met with public outrage. How could they support someone accused of something so horrific? What did they know? People online dug into the Kohberger family history. Every Facebook post, every LinkedIn resume, every school photo was analyzed. The court of public opinion had issued its verdict long before a jury would. As the legal process began, experts weighed in on Bryan's mental state. Some labeled him a textbook narcissist. Others suggested schizoid personality traits, emotional detachment, social awkwardness, inability to form real relationships. There were also whispers of an incel connection, a deep resentment toward women, particularly confident, attractive ones. Many pointed out that the victims represented the kind of people Bryan might have envied or resented. Socially successful, outgoing, admired. Still, Bryan showed no remorse. Not a single word of apology. Not a single glance toward the victims' families. In court, he looked ahead, blinked slowly, and sat still, like he was observing the trial as a case study, not as the accused. In the weeks following the arrest, a wave of affidavits and court filings revealed how authorities had built their case. Phone records showed his device had been near the crime scene 12 times before the murders, mostly in the late evening or early morning hours. Surveillance footage captured his Hyundai Elantra circling the neighborhood multiple times between 3:29 and 4:20 a.m., the window when the killings occurred. A knife sheath with a U.S. Marine Corps insignia was found on Madison Mogen's bed. The DNA on the sheath was a 99.9998% match to Bryan, confirmed through genetic genealogy and his father's DNA. A search of Bryan's apartment in Pullman revealed a stained mattress, latex gloves, hair strands, and a computer with digital forensics software. He had cleaned his car. He had wiped his devices. He had worn gloves. But he missed one detail: he left the sheath behind. Public debate swirled around one haunting question. What does evil really look like? Bryan Kohberger didn't have the face of a movie villain. No tattoos, no visible rage, no eccentric behavior caught on camera. He looked like a student, a nerd in a criminology lab. And yet, this was the man who had allegedly stalked, hunted, and slaughtered for young adults in the dead of night. Experts pointed to the concept of the organized killer, someone who plans, studies, rehearses, someone who blends in. Bryan didn't break down after the crime. He just went to class on Monday. As prosecutors prepared for trial, Bryan's defense team began crafting a narrative. They argued that the DNA match was not conclusive proof of guilt. The car seen near the house wasn't definitively his. The cell phone pings didn't place him inside the house. But the court of public opinion was already lost. Online, Bryan was demonized. True crime channels posted videos with titles like "The Cold Eyes of a Killer," "Kohberger," "The Student Who Snapped," "Inside the Mind of a Modern-Day Ted Bundy." Meme pages turned his courtroom sketches into dark satire. Psychologists gave televised opinions. Even people who had never met Bryan were sharing personal experiences and theories. This wasn't just a trial. It had become a spectacle. At one court hearing, the presiding judge issued a sharp warning. This case will be tried in this courtroom, not on TikTok, not on YouTube, not on Reddit. But it was too late. Bryan Kohberger was now a symbol of modern crime, of internet justice, of academic evil. His name was permanently carved into the history of American true crime. In public statements and tearful interviews, the victims' families pleaded for one thing: answers. Kaylee's father said, "I just want to know why. That's it. Just why." Madison's mother asked, "What made him think he had the right to take for innocent lives?" Xana's family described the daily torment of walking past her empty room. Ethan's triplet siblings spoke about the gaping hole left in their family. And Bryan? He said nothing. Just like the night of the murders. Just like every moment since. For most killers, the arrest is the end. But for Bryan Kohberger, it was only the beginning of the mystery. A courtroom full of silence. A town still broken. A nation still asking, why these victims? Why that house? Why that night? He studied killers. He understood patterns. He tracked every move. But in the end, Bryan Kohberger never told us why he did it. He hasn't confessed. He hasn't offered a motive. And maybe that's what makes this case so disturbing. Because despite all the evidence, all the psychology, all the analysis, we still don't know what flipped inside Bryan Kohberger's mind, or why he chose that house, those 4 victims, or that specific night. But if we dig deep enough into his past, his obsessions, his thoughts, his silence, we start to see the outline of something terrifying. A mind that wasn't just broken. It was waiting. Bryan Kohberger didn't fit the typical serial killer profile. He wasn't visibly unstable. He wasn't charismatic like Bundy. He wasn't erratic like Ramirez. Instead, he was something worse: high-functioning, intelligent, and methodical. Psychologists studying the case have pointed out traits aligned with narcissistic personality disorder, a belief in his intellectual superiority, entitlement, and lack of empathy. Obsessive-compulsive traits evident in the ritualistic planning, cleaning, and control. Schizoid tendencies, extreme social detachment, emotional coldness, and inner fantasy worlds. Incel ideology, potential resentment toward attractive, socially successful women. But this wasn't just about labels. It was about loneliness turned lethal. People who knew Bryan described him in fragments. Childhood friends. He was bullied. Kids picked on his weight. He changed after high school, got skinnier, but he also got meaner. Classmates. He always thought he was smarter than everyone else. Former addicts. He used to do heroin, got clean, then got obsessed with criminal justice. Roommates. He was distant, cold, would go silent for hours. Professors. Brilliant, one of the best papers I ever read. Each of these pieces tells a story, not of a man who snapped, but of one who transformed himself into the very thing he once studied. Investigators believe Kohberger had no personal connection to the victims. He wasn't in their social circles. He didn't date them. He wasn't in their classes. But his cell phone data tells a different story. He had driven past 1122 King Road at least a dozen times before the night of the murders, mostly late at night or early morning. Some theorize he may have spotted one or more of the victims in public, at a restaurant, a party, or a university event, and become fixated. Fixation is common in targeted killings. It's not about knowing the victim personally. It's about projecting emotions onto them. They become symbols of rejection, of everything the killer believes he's not, of everything he believes they don't deserve. Though Bryan hasn't spoken, psychologists and criminologists have proposed 4 major theories behind his motive. As someone who studied criminology, Bryan may have become obsessed with dominating the unknown, crossing the line between observer and participant. He didn't just want to understand evil. He wanted to orchestrate it. Murder, for him, may have been the ultimate expression of power and intellectual control. The victims, particularly Kaylee and Madison, represented everything Bryan may have felt denied in life: popularity, connection, love, tension. Forums tied to incel ideology frequently express hatred for women who reject them or overlook them. Bryan's lack of romantic relationships and deep social disconnect could have fed a dark resentment over time. This theory suggests Bryan wanted to see if he could get away with it. He studied criminal behavior. He interned with police. He understood how investigations work. The killings may have been a live experiment, testing if his knowledge of forensics, psychology, and criminal procedure was enough to commit the perfect murder. Some killers act not out of rage or revenge, but out of curiosity. To feel something, to break the boundary, to chase the adrenaline high that nothing else can match. Bryan may have simply wanted to feel the power of life and death in his hands. And when it was over, he wanted to watch the chaos unfold. Even without a confession, the evidence paints a chilling picture. DNA on the knife sheath left beside Madison Mogen. 12 digital visits to the house before the killings. Surveillance footage showing the white Elantra fleeing at 4:20 a.m. His phone turning off during the exact window of the attack. Driving back to the scene later that morning, after the murders. Wearing latex gloves inside his parents' home while taking out trash. Telling police he likes to hike at 4 a.m. when questioned later. Every move was measured, but still, he slipped. He left a sheath. He returned to the scene. He underestimated the power of modern forensics. To this day, Bryan Kohberger has said nothing about the crime. No motive, no denial, no apology. Some believe it's strategic. His lawyers may be preparing a mental health defense. Others think it's a power play, keeping control by maintaining silence. But many believe the reason runs deeper. Bryan doesn't speak because he got what he wanted. The world is watching. The trial is pending. If Bryan is convicted, he faces life in prison or the death penalty. Prosecutors say they'll seek the maximum sentence. Victims' families are expected to testify. Expert witnesses will analyze his every word, every motion. And when the verdict comes, we may finally hear from Bryan himself for the first time. Or maybe we won't. Maybe he'll take the motive to the grave. And maybe that's the final cruelty of it all. This wasn't a random act. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was calculated, cold, and clinical, committed by someone who studied how not to get caught. Bryan Kohberger was the kind of person who blended in, the kind who sits quietly in class, nods politely, grades your paper, and disappears at night with gloves and a knife. That's what scares us most. Because if someone like Bryan could do this, who else is watching? Who else is waiting? He spent his life trying to understand killers. But in the end, we're the ones left trying to understand him. For more chilling true crime stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel.